Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf nun dalid. I want to start with a few minor points I want to correct from yesterday. One is, okay, we did right, it's really one. Okay, so what we saw yesterday, I just want to go back for a minute to the sugya that we saw in Amud Bet. We wanted to know where we get the fact about the Shtei Matanot Shein Arba and how we do the Shtei Matanot Shein Arba. We had a machlok at Rav and Shmuel, notain v'chozer v'notain, or is it kimin gama? Is it two on each side, right? While you're on the side, you do two placings, one on this side of the wall, one on that side, or do you do it in one motion, which is kind of, right angled, like you start on one side and you go to the other. Then we said it was actually based on Machloket Tanaim. And here I got a little confused with the psukim in the context. So let's just go through the drasha again. Yachol yizrakenu zrika achat. I'm right in the middle of Nun Gimel Amud Bet. You might have thought you could throw out one zrika. It says saviv, so then it says, if it says saviv, you might have thought, right, it has to be around, all around the whole thing. It says zarku. How is that? Kamin gama. Okay, that was fine. Then comes Rabbi Yishmael. Right, and then he says, and then it's Shtei Matanot Shein Arba. Rabbi Yishmael says, it says here Saviv, and it says Lahalan Saviv. Now here's where I got confused, because the Saviv, I looked in the Torah or, and it quotes it by the Shlamim. But it's not the Shlamim. And here's something sounded wrong, because the Shlamim is not four placings, okay? So we're going to go like this. It's the Ola, Shlamim, and Asham all say Saviv. Really what Amai Gemara they were pointing out is the Saviv that we're learning to is not just about the Ola, it's about the Shlamim and the Asham, which also are done two, which are four. Okay, and then the question is, where do we get it by all of them? It says saviv by all of them. So saviv, right? So what does saviv mean? So you might have thought, so now they're going to say, we're going to learn saviv from a different place where it says saviv. And this was my mistake yesterday. That place is in Vayikra chapter 8, which is all about the miluim, on those unique korbanot they brought on the days of the miluim, when the kohanim, when they were sanctifying the tabernacle for the first time. And there's a korban chatat, which is placed in all four corners, like all korbanot chatat. And there it says saviv, and that's where we're learning it from. So that was my error yesterday. And that's what it was talking about with pisuk and arba matanot. There it's done in all four corners and with a break between each one. In other words, you don't do two that are four. So the question is, right, that's the Bright is trying to get to, if we're going to learn saviv from there, that has to be on all four corners, but if it has to be on all four corners, it sounds like, if it has to be on all four sides, sounds like it also has to be on all four corners. You have to walk around and do it four times, and that's not what we do here. So then they say, that's because the Ola needs Yesod, and not just the Ola, but all the korbanot need Yesod, and since there's no Yesod, therefore, right, we can't do it there. So, right, the chatat doesn't need yesod because that was done on the four corners. That was a different thing. But the rest of them need to be done on a part where there's the yesod underneath. The ola doesn't have, right? There won't be an option for that if you do it on all four corners. And that's how we got to Shtei Shein Arba. Okay, so sorry for that mistake. Now I've corrected it. Okay, then we got into this whole thing about, right, how do we know that the Kerem Mizrachit didn't have a yesod? Or why didn't it? Not how do we know, but why didn't have a yesod? And then we ended with this idea, which we're going to talk about a lot today, which is that according to the bracha of Yaakov that he gave to Binyamin, right? It was this thing about in the morning there'll be. Let me just get the pasuk out. 1 second. Open the pasuk so I can say it exactly right. The pasuk is Binyamin Ze'ev Yitraf. Okay, this is Breshit 49. Verse 27. Baboker yochal ad v'la'erev yichalek shalal. Okay, in the morning it will eat ad, which is hard to translate, and in the evening yichalek shalal. He will distribute the booty. Now, what is this? This doesn't really sound like it's talking about the temple, but the Targum says, and we're going to talk about two different versions of the Targum, but we'll just go with the basic right now. Ba'achsante yitbnei midbacha. Midbacha is mizbeach. In his, right, this is all Aramaic, in his achsante, in his territory, will be built the mizbeach, and that's the morning. And the evening, the korbanot tamid will be brought on the altar. So, because it will be brought in the area of Binyamin, that's how we learned that there was no yesod there, because there couldn't be a yesod, because it didn't belong to Binyamin, that area. So there were those two strips on the south side and on the east side didn't have a yesod because it wasn't really Binyamin's property. And since the Mizbeach could only be built according to Yaakov's bracha, the drasha is that it could only be built in the Shatach of Binyamin, so we couldn't build it there. Today we're going to learn something a little different, but that's how we understood it yesterday. And then we ended with why Binyamin was ra'oi to get the Kodesh Kodeshim in his property, that would be built in his territory, because he was upset all the time about the loss of that space and that it wasn't his, and that, it was looked at as a good thing, that he really wanted it all to be in his territory. Sometimes you could look at that as it's not a good thing, but he really wanted it so badly that God gave him, as we call it in Hebrew, a chupar, like a prize. The Shekhinah will be in your presence. Okay, now we get to Meitiv. Now we have a difficulty. What's this a difficulty on? On the fact that there's no Yesod on the southeast side. Okay, this is a very difficult section. Not difficult in terms of like some sugyot are difficult and it's very, it's confusing, hard to follow. This is just difficult because it's very hard to understand what the question is. And Rashi goes with one interpretation, which seems really quite hard to see in the simple reading. Tosfot, if you look at Tosfot right now, you can see there's a Tosfot that covers almost the entire page. Okay, Tosfot suggests a bunch of different possibilities. Okay, I'll try to give you a little taste of what's going on here, but know that this is quite a hard thing to understand what the question is and also what the answer is. Meitive. Olat ha'of ketzad tanasit. So now we're talking about the burnt offering of a bird. If you remember, this is like, okay, it's hard to keep all these things in your head, but generally, we do the blood on the bottom part of the altar underneath that Chut HaSikra line. But sometimes, like in the Chatat, where it has to go on the four corners, the Chatat of an animal, and the burnt offering of a bird is also offered on the top part of the altar. We saw that yesterday. So the Olat HaOf Ketzare Tanasi. Now, it doesn't say this, but the assumption is the person who's doing this is standing on the Sovev, the Kohen. Okay, so he's midpoint, if you remember, just above midpoint, 6 cubits off the ground. Okay, now you have to remember, the Chut HaSikra is that red demarcating line of the midpoint, which is at 5 amot. So he's just 1 amma above that, and he's got a few amot to go for the top. And that's where he stands when he does the malika, which is the slaughtering that goes on in the temple of the bird, and the sprinkling of the blood. And the other thing you have to know, which it doesn't say here, but he gets up the ramp going up, and the first place he gets to is where he does it, which is, remember, what's the first place? It's the southeast corner. So he's standing in the space where there's no yesod underneath. Okay? Now, Hayam moleket rosho mimul orpas. So he does the malika, basically breaking right from the back of the neck, umavdil, and he separates, meaning he cuts the trachea and the esophagus, basically slaughtering the animal, but not in a method of slaughtering, but in malika way. Umimatzeh dama al kir hamizbech, and then he smears the blood on the wall of the mizbech. Now, what's the problem? Where is he doing this? On the corner where there's no base underneath. Okay? Now, what's the idea of there being a base underneath? Because you want the blood to drip down. As it drips down, it has to go into something that's where there's a mizbeach. Okay? And that's why we always do the bloods, the shtei matanot are on those sides. Now, here we're at the top. Now, theoretically, you would say the blood's not going to drip down. And this is what Rashi raises as a difficulty of this whole thing. Because, what do you mean? The blood's going to drip. If he's standing on the sovev goes out, juts out 1 cubit. So the Kohen's standing there and puts it on the wall above him. So where's it going to drip? Onto the sovev. So what's the problem? It doesn't drip down all the way to the yesod because the sovev goes out in amma, right? The yesod is 1 more cubit out, but it's got the sovev to go. It's not like when you're standing on the floor on the ground nearby, and you throw it on the wall, and you have to make sure there's a yesod underneath for the wall for it to drip. You actually have the sovev. So Rashi says at the end of Dibur Matril, umematzemi dama, he says v'yitema nofel ala sovev. It's going to fall on the sovev. So what's the problem? So they say, I'm just skipping a little bit. Delok. Okay, so right. So he basically quotes this Gemara later. I'm not going to read this inside, but there's a Gemara later that says that now you assume the Kohen standing on the sovev. This is where the question gets a little tricky according to Rashi. If he stands on the sovev, so he's obviously pouring the blood upward, and again, it's going to fall right on the sovev where he's standing, so there shouldn't be a problem. But since he's at the height of 6 cubits, and there's 1 cubit underneath him, that he could still do it, and there's a Gemara that says that if he were to bend down and put the blood right underneath him, it was valid. then in that unique case, why he would do that, I have no idea. It won't fall down onto the yesod. That's Rashi's explanation of the question. It's a little out there. Some people say, and this also works a little better with the answer, which you haven't seen yet, and Tosfot, one of the opinions quoted, is that the concern is that we're just in airspace that's like the Sovev is not very wide. It's 1 cubit, if you think, right? The airspace of a person, we always talk about the space of a person is 4 amot, right? So I think the concern is either that you're standing there on the Sovev, but, blood goes everywhere, and from there it's going to fall down below, and that you have to make sure there's a base underneath, or just, something, or that maybe it has to be done in the airspace where there's a yesod underneath. So again, right under the Sovev, there is a yesod, right? It is part of it, but there's nothing, right? 1 amma out, already not. It's a little hard to understand the question, so we're going to just go on. To which the Gemara answers, which is also difficult, and you'll see where Rashi has to add something in, otherwise it makes no sense according to what he says. So again, according to that, I'm just reading the question again. If you say there's no yesod, then he's doing it just merely in the air. Now what that doesn't mean is you're doing it merely in the air, but without a yesod underneath it. To which Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Emar kachitnu. Avir, in other words, and again, you're in the airspace of not just where there's no yesod. I think I didn't say it right. You're in the airspace of Yehuda, basically. In other words, where's that blood going down? It's going down through the airspace of Yehuda. According to Rashi, it hits the ground where it's Yehuda, and it's not Binyamin. And according to Tosfot, or one of the interpretations of Tosfot, the issue is that you're working on this korban in the airspace, which is really Yehuda. So, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Imar kachitnu, avir de Binyamin, karka de Yehuda. They say that this is the deal that Binyamin and Yehuda made. Okay, you can try to imagine such a complicated thing, but you could imagine sometimes people can make these arrangements. The air space where the altar is and where above the yesod, and above where there theoretically could be a yesod, in other words, that whole area of the altar, airspace belongs to Binyamin. Land, those 2 strips belong to Yehuda. So in the southeast corner, while the land belonged to Yehuda, the airspace above it belonged to Binyamin, and that's why it was able to be done there. Okay? Now, this works very well according to Tosfot, because the whole point is you're doing this korban in the airspace, right above which there's no yesod, but the airspace is what's concerning us, that you're in the space of Yehuda while you're doing it. According to Rashi, still the blood's going to fall on the ground, so how does that help? So Rashi has to add, which is, I challenge you to go look at pictures of the altar. I happen to not notice any that actually include what Rashi says, but it could be I just didn't look well enough. But Rashi claims that there was I'm reading this inside just so you believe me. Emar kach v'chule in Rashi. Okay, this gets us back to Levud, if you remember Levud, in Sukkah and Eruvin. If something's within 3 tfachim of the ground, or 3 tfachim of something else, it's as if it's attached. So somewhere above 3 tfachim off the ground, so that it not be considered the ground belonging to Yehuda, asui kimim blitak tana keneged otak keren. In that corner, there was a little thing jutting out from the wall of the altar that would accept the blood of the olat ha'of, so that it won't fall on the ground. So Rashi claims, even though it doesn't say so in the Gemara, and that's one of the things Tosfot says, where do you come from? Where is that? Okay, but that's what Rashi claims to explain. So it's it's not a complicated Gemara, it's just hard to understand what the Gemara is talking about, because it's hard to understand the question, and it's even hard to understand the answer. Okay, we're going to move on and be satisfied with a little bit of what we saw about it. I'm Rav Nachman. We finished that. My lo hava la yesod. Now we get into there's 2 main sugyas today. The first is, what does it mean it doesn't have a yesod? Now, what did we assume it meant? And from the pictures, any picture you see of the mizbeach, it means that, again, the mizbeach was 32 by 32, but it wasn't really 32 by 32, because on 2 sides, right, we always think of the mizbeach as a perfect square, and the top is a perfect square, and the sovev is a perfect square, but the yesod is strip, strip, empty, empty, right? It's got 2 sides and 2 sides not. And it just juts out a little bit more, right, on those 2 sides where it's not, right? It juts out a little more to the south, a little to the east, but that's it. And it doesn't really have anything, right? Just 1 amma on each of those sides and nothing else. The other space is empty. So that's Rav. Rav Amar b'Binyan. What he said is, what does it mean it didn't have a yesod? It wasn't built. Okay, there was an area there just not built. Levi Amal b'Damin. Levi has a different interpretation. He says, what do you mean? It was built. And this is, like I say, always a problem with pictures. Pictures show one way, okay? But according to this, there's a machloket. According to this, the Mizbeach, and when all these books, when they print pictures of like the Machon Mikdash and these other books that are printed and they show, in the Machon Mikdash you could see the things built, they're always going by an opinion, okay? They don't build it in 2 or 3 different ways. Sometimes they'll show you something according to 2 opinions. Usually it's one place, right? Also the maps that we've been using of the Beit HaMikdash, there's a lot of machlokot, like where the Mizbeach was situated in the room. So in a picture, you can only put it in one place. You can't have it moving. Obviously on the computer, on Canva or something, you can play with it. But in a flat picture, you can't really express this. So Levi says it was actually physically there. You just couldn't pour the blood there. It wasn't a place to accept blood. Okay, so but it looked the same. It's just this area was designated for blood and this area wasn't. So Rav Mitargem, now what's the basis? First we're going to see the basis, then we're going to have 4 sources. It's going to be the main part of our sugya today. 4 sources that are going to try to prove one way or the other. The way it's going to work is, now we would have thought Rav is much more intuitive. That's the way we've been viewing it until now. But in fact, we're going to bring 1 source to prove Rav over Levi and 3 sources that really go against Rav. Okay, but in the end, we're going to have responses to all of our difficulties and we're going to be left without any resolution, although the pictures show that really the direction is that it's Rav. So here's the basis of their machloket, and it all depends on that pasuk in Breshit that I quoted before about Binyamin, about the morning and the evening and what this means, and the targum on that pasuk. So Rav Mitargem, as we said before, now we didn't say it in the Gemara, it was the commentaries brought it up then, but ba'achsantei yit b'nei midbacha. In his territory will be built the Mizbech. Dalet and Zion switch in Aramaic. So Midbacha is Mizbech. So in his territory, the Mizbech will be built, and that's very clear. It's not his territory, though, so we don't build it. Levi Mitargem, Ba'achsantei yitbane mikdasha. The Mikdash will be built. Now you think Mikdash means the temple, but what they're going to say is Makom Mikudash L'Damim. Mikdash comes from sanctification. It's a place that's sanctified for blood. In his territory will be the place that's sanctified for blood. But there might be something built which is not in his territory and it won't be sanctified for blood. So the altar can be built in the Shetach of Yehuda. It just, the parts that are in Yehuda can't be used for blood. So he thinks it was completely built. So, like I said, 4 sources. Now we're going to start with the first. Tashma. Hayesod hayam alech al pnei kol hatzafon v'al pnei kol ha'ma'arav. Okay, it went on the south side and on the north side. Ochel b'darom ha'ma'achat u'b'mizrach ha'ma'achat. And it jutted out 1 cubit to the south. That was on the west, right? The western one jutted out into the south side. In other words, it got to the south side at the end there. So 1 cubit. And on the east, it went 1 cubit. That was the north side of it, jutted out 1 cubit to the east. So what do you see here? It sounds very clear, like it wasn't built, right? It sounds like there was a strip here, a strip there, and it didn't go continue on the whole side. My ochel nami b'damim. They say, oh, you want to explain this according to Levi? When it says ochel b'darom ha'ma'achat, and that's ochel b'darom, ochel is just a weird word anyway. It means to eat, right? It eats up the space. So it sounded like it juts out. But you could say this is talking about the space that could be used and consume the blood. The place that could consume the blood was 1 cubit into the south and 1 cubit to the east of the, of where it was on the northwest sides, and then jutted out a drop here, a drop there. The rest of it, which existed, wasn't able to be used for blood, though. Okay, second source. Tashma. The altar was 32 by 32. Now, if you don't have that strip and you don't have that strip, it wasn't actually a square of 32 by 32. So, they're saying if you look at it from the side, in other words, it jutted out on 2 sides, 32 by 32. That was like saying, as if you draw this imaginary line on the other side, because it really is a square. It's just missing 2 little strips. But if you talk about the sides in general, you say 32 by 32, and that's fine. Third source. Tashma nimtza poreach hamal yisov hamal sovev. This was the ramp. The ramp that went up from the south. Okay, so the ramp hit the Mizbech on the south side where we claim there's no Yesod. It was 32, the length of the ramp, and the side of the Mizbech, the length of the Mizbech was 32. So 32 plus 32 would get you the 64, but it actually says that the length of the whole altar in its entirety, from the ramp to the end, is 62. So how do they explain that? They say, because the ramp went up to the top, but the top we're going to see this soon, although we've talked about it, was 28 by 28. You add the sovev, it was another 2 cubits, that's 30 by 30, and then you add the yesod, that's 32 by 32. So what did they say? When the ramp went up to the top, obviously 2 cubits were overlapping, right? The ramp overlapped on top of the sovev and on top of the yesod. And what do you see there? It's on the south side. Now, there was no yesod. So when they explain how they get to 62, they say the mizbeach was poreach, right? The ramp went over the amal yesod and amal sovev. There was an overlap, and that's why those 2 cubits don't count. Sounds like there was a yesod there. According to Rav, there was no yesod on the south side. Ema keneged amal yesod va'al amal sovev. They're saying what they meant was it overlapped 1 cubit where the yesod theoretically should have been, like the imaginary yesod. Just like when you draw that 32 by 32 line, there's not really a yesod there. But since it goes, right, in other places, it goes out that far. So that's what they're saying. It overlapped the space where theoretically there could have been a yesod, and also over the sovev, which actually was in existence because sovev was on all 4 sides. Okay, tashma. Now we get to the more interesting source, I think, which is really describing, it's interesting to learn. This is our last source, going to be our 3rd difficulty on Rav, 4th source that we brought in general here. And we're going to have a braita brought by Levi. Okay, no surprise, because it's going to definitely sound more like Levi. Detane Levi. Okay, he brought a braita. Now this braita is going to describe why it's interesting is how they built the altar. Okay, I know, like when we learn the Gemara, a lot of us are thinking, how did this work? And how did they build it? And how did they do it? And it's just great when they teach, they don't always answer those questions. But here they talk about how is it really built. Now you have to remember one thing. You're not allowed to use, you have to use whole pieces of stone, or so it sounds like. We're going to learn it wasn't really, okay, we're going to learn, the stones have to be whole. They can't be broken. Like you can't break them and, like that. So that's going to create one thing of how we're going to do this exactly. Okay, so let's start. How do you build the altar? Mivi'im malbein. They brought a frame, okay, a square frame. Malbein in Hebrew is, in modern Hebrew is a rectangle, but obviously it was a square, okay, a malbein. Shu 32 al 32 v'gavho. So first they brought a frame that was 1 cubit high and 32 by 32. Mevi chalukei avanim mefulamot. They brought moist stones. Okay, now moist stones. Okay, so what material? I saw written in the Koran that it was wood. I don't know where that comes from. It was wood, but they claim it was a wood frame. I don't know where that came from. Here it doesn't say what material, but they brought a frame. Then they would bring stones. Okay, mifulamot. Bit of a debate what this means, but Rashi says they're moist, meaning like they're softer. They're, when you have stones that are in the water, right? They're smoother. That's, I think, the word I was looking for. Not softer, but smoother. Ben gdolot, ben ktanot. Okay, small ones and big ones. It wasn't like they took one huge chunk of stone. That's like impossible. So what they do, because also you can't use barzel on it. Like if you wanted to, you can't use iron implements to smooth it out or anything. So what they do, they took these stones, small and big. They filled it up with the stones. Maybe seed vikunya v'zefet. They bring plaster, molten lead, and tar, and then they basically shofech, memache v'shofech, and then they poured it all on, smeared it all in, and then let it dry, and that's how, right? So that would basically keep the stones together. V'zeu makom yesod, and that's where the yesod goes. Okay, you can already see the problem. What's the problem? They filled the space of 32 by 32. Didn't say cutting out 2 strips. Sounds very clear. So that's how they built the yesod. We're going to keep going on. In other words, since the mizbeach was 28 by 28 at the top, 30 by 30 by the sovev, and 32 by 32 in the bottom, how they build it, it's basically made up of different squares. So one square is 1 cubit high. That's the height of the yesod. Now we're going to get to the next piece, which is the sovev, okay? And then the next piece, which is the top part. That's how it was built. You kind of imagine this Lego kind of thing, right? The way it was built in parts like this. So then they would bring, it's super interesting to see how they did this. Okay, so the next thing, Choseru mevi malbein shu 30 amal 30 amal. So now they brought the 30 by 30, because again, with the sovev, right, the sovev jutted out to 30 cubits. V'gavho 5 amot, and it was 5 amot high. That's what we said yesterday, right? The sovev, I was a little confused because I have 5 in my head, but 5 from the yesod, right? First the yesod, which is 1, then another 5, that gets you to 6. Umevi chalukei avanim v'chulei. And then you do the same thing. You bring the stones, you bring the tar, the plaster, the molten lead, pour it all in. Okay. Then chozer umevi maben shu 28 al 28 amot. V'gofo 3 amot. Now you have 3 more cubits till you get to the top. So that's 3 amot high, 28 by 28. You fill that in, mevi chalukei v'chulei. V'hu makom ha'maracha. And that's what we call the maracha. That's the top where they put the fires and burnt the sacrifices. V'chozer mevi maben. What's left? The kranot. So for this, what kind of maben do you need? Amal amal. 1 by 1 cubit. Okay, 1 by 1 height and 1 by 1 length and width. Okay, it's really 1 by 1 by 1. Umevi chalukei avanim v'fulamot, ben gdolot ben ktanot. And again, now they just describe it again instead of saying v'chulei. Umevi zefet v'kunyo u'memacheh v'shofech v'zeu keren. Okay, and that's the kranot. V'chein l'kol keren v'keren, and you would have to use that mold basically 4 times. Okay, so now we get back to our question. V'chi tema. Now, if you want to say, turning now to Amabet, digayizle, maybe they cut it after they did that. Okay, so they poured the mold in, right? Took off the mold, and then cut around the sides. Well, you obviously can't do that. Avanim shleimo ktiv. So it can't be that. So what do they answer? Because again, this seems very clear like Levi. They built it 32 by 32, complete. So they answered, even though it didn't say this. You have to wonder why they didn't say this in the Braita. But they would put before, so they put down the mold, and then they put in another thing that's basically 1 cubit in height, goes across the length that you're not supposed to have a yesod there, and put it there, pour everything on, and then take that out, and then, right, the same way if you paint on your wall, let's say, and you want to paint a design, so the easiest way to do it is you put tape in the places where you don't want it to be, and then you can paint over it, right, pull off the tape, and the paint isn't there, right? So that's the idea here. They put the mold in and then took it out, right? They put in something in its place, took it out, and then it was empty. So that's how we could explain this according to Rav. And now they're going to basically prove that there's precedent for doing something like this. Okay, that we're not just making this up, but they must have done this somewhere else. Where? When they did the kranot. How so? Okay, the horns of the altar. If you don't say that there's a possibility to do that kind of thing, and also, by the way, it wasn't mentioned in the Mishnah either in that other place, and they definitely did it in the other place, in the Braita, in that other place. Hada Amar Rav Kahana, Avanim shel kranot chalu lotayu. Rav Kahana said that the stone by the corners of the altar, by the horns, had holes in it. Now Rashi says there were kind of holes, but other people say it was actually hollow, completely hollow. Dichtiv, how do we know this? Because of a pasuk that says, Umal'u kim, this is a pasuk in Zechariah. Okay? Umal'u kim mizrak kizaviyot mizbech. They filled it like a mizrak, which is those are the bowls or utensils that they would use that would hold things in the altar, like you would bring the blood in the mizrak. Okay? Like the corners of the altar. As the corners of the altar were meant for pouring blood in. So they accepted blood. They must have, if it was not hollow and totally filled, then basically you would end up with, right, it doesn't collect anything, it's totally full. So it must be that when they filled up the mold for the kranot mizbeach, it must be they must have had something inside that was blocking part of it, so it wouldn't be completely filled. So again, Rashi says it was more like some holes, like little areas. Other people say, no, it was completely hollowed inside, so it would be really like a mizrek, that it could accept the blood, and that was to accept the blood that was poured inside of it. So just like there, hachanami, avanim shleimot amar Rachmana, right there also, if you don't say there was some other method of doing this, you can't say they cut the stone out after, because it has to be complete stones. It must be they put something in it and then took it out after the mold was dried. It must be the same thing they did here, and that's what we explain according to Rav. So we now finish that sugya about Rav and Levi's machloket, about the yesod. Was it physically there according to Levi, and it just couldn't be used for blood, or was there actually nothing there, which is the way we normally see it in all the pictures, and that's Rav. And again, 1 difficulty with Levi that we resolved, and 3 difficulties with Rav that we resolved. Okay, but now the question, we're going to get into a whole drasha of Rava, and this is going to take us almost till the end till we get to the next Mishnah. And then the next Mishnah we'll finish our daf. My dichtiv vayelach David. Now we're going to talk about how did they choose the space where the temple was going to be. We talked about Binyamin. It has to be in the shetach of Binyamin. First of all, we saw that from the bracha of Yaakov. But the question is, how did David figure this all out? Where it's supposed to be? How did he know where to build the temple? So, and even if you say it's Binyamin, there's a lot of spaces in Binyamin. It didn't have to be specifically there. So, my dichtiv, they're going to darshan this pasuk in Shmuel I, chapter 19, verse 19. Vayelach David and Shmuel v'yeshvu b'noyot b'Ramah. So, David and Shmuel go and they sit in Noyot, which is in the Ramah. Now, it sounds like Noyot is a new place, and Ramah is the place where Shmuel lived. So, the Gemara asks, Nayot, it's a Ramah. And Nayot sounds like it's some other place, not Ramah. So what does it mean they were sitting in Noyot in Ramah? Doesn't make any sense. Ella, Shayu Yoshvim, what they're going to darshan is Nayot. Ella Shayu Yoshvim b'Ramah, ve'oskim b'Noyot shel olam. They were sitting in Ramah and they were learning Torah. What were they learning? The Noyot of the world. Noyot, first of all, Noy is a beautiful thing. They were learning about the beautiful place, the Beit HaMikdash, basically. And also we call the Beit HaMikdash a Naveh, like an oasis. I think the translation maybe is an oasis, but a beautiful place, basically. And I'm not sure if that's the best translation, but Naveh, someone could look it up and tell me how to translate it into English. But so now, the question is, how did they know? And what were they sitting there learning Torah, trying to figure out where are we going to build the temple? So it says in the Torah, you're going to go up to that place. So from there you learn that the Beit HaMikdash must be taller, that it must be the highest place in Israel. Right? In other words, it's this idea that all Israel, that's why we always call it making aliyah, is higher than all the other lands, and the Beit HaMikdash is higher than all the other places in Israel. But they didn't know where it was. So what'd they do? Sefer Yoshua. They took out Sefer Yoshua. What'd they look at? All the different territories. The question is to figure out whose territories it's supposed to be in. Okay, or maybe Okay, so there's different girsaot here, but and the boundary went down, and the boundary went up here, and the boundary was drawn. Okay, different words describing the boundaries of all, right? In Sefer Joshua, there's a whole description of who gets what land, and it starts defining all the boundaries, and it uses all these different words. B'Shevet Binyamin, but when you look at Shevet Binyamin, v'alaktiv, v'yarad lo ktiv. It always says, and the boundary went up, and the boundary went up, and the boundary went up. It never says, and it went down. So it must be Binyamin is in the highest place in the land. So they saw that as a sign. This is where the temple is supposed to be, in the Shetach of Binyamin. Notice he doesn't quote the pasuk from Vayechi, right? He could have quoted. Savor now. Okay, but where in Binyamin are you going to build it? Savor lemivnei be'Ein Eitam dimidle. So they figured out where's the highest point, Ein Eitam. So if you look in the Quran, they have a good footnote about Ein Eitam. There's a place called Ein Eitam. They said it only in English, but I looked it up online. It seems to be this Ein Itun, which sounds like Ein Eitam. Ein Itun, which is southwest of Beit Lechem. And it happens to be, according to the Quran, 25 meters higher than the Har HaBayit, than the Temple Mount. Okay, so it is higher. But then they realized, because of this bracha to Binyamin, of between Ktefav, between two things it will dwell. So now if something dwells between two things, usually those two things are higher and it's somewhat lower. So they said it can't be the highest, so let's pick something lower. And that's how they got to the space where they chose. Well, that's one interpretation. According to the second interpretation, they actually started by knowing it was going to be in Binyamin, and that's what we're going to see here. And this all comes from the brachot, because lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda u'mechoket mi bein raglav, right? That the shevet, the Sanhedrin, right now it also means judges and things like that, but the ruling is going to be from Yehuda, and therefore that's going to be in the Shetach of Yehuda, and the Shekhinah from Binyamin. Now, what else do we know? The Lishkat HaGazit, which is where the Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin sat, was in the Beit HaMikdash. So that means that we have to find a space where Yehuda is right next to Binyamin, because the Shekhinah is going to be in Binyamin, and the Sanhedrin in Yehuda. So, So if they chose this Ein Eitam, mitpaleg tuva, it's going to be too far away from Yehuda. That's nowhere near where Judea was camped. Mutav denichte beporta, and what's the problem though? But that's the highest place. Well, in addition, now we're going to bring up the other one, which is better to move it a little bit lower, because of the wording, bein tefav shachen, again, implying that it's a little shorter than something else. Now, we have two interpretations here, either starting from Sefer Yoshua or starting really from Vayichi and the connection of the Sanhedrin and the Beit HaMikdash, but that's what caused them to determine where the Beit HaMikdash is going to be. Okay, why did Doeg Adomi get into a whole thing with David? According to this, because Doeg Adomi was a big Talmid Chacham, as we saw from Sanhedrin, if you remember, Parak Chelek, but he got jealous of David. Okay, because he said, I tried to figure out where this place is and I couldn't figure it out, and David succeeded, and he was jealous of David. How do we know this? For this, there's an allusion to this in a Tehillim, where David's complaining about people who tried to kill him. Okay, the jealousy about your house, God, is what caused me to achaltani. I had to eat it, meaning people wanted to eat me up and destroy me. Uktiv, and it also says about this, Zechor Hashem leDavid et kol unoto. Okay, this is again from Tehillim. God should remember all the suffering. Asher Nishba, I just want to double check this is in Tehillim, right? This is, also Tehillim, this is in Tehillim Kuf Lamed Bet. Asher Nishba la Hashem imavo ba'ol beiti ve'imeten shenat le'enai afapai tnuma adam tamakom la Hashem. Okay, so the first part of this pasuk talks about that he's asking David is asking God to remember all the days of his suffering where he was poring over this, trying to determine where is the place, because he said, I'm not going to sleep until I find a place, or I'm not going to go sit in my house before I find a place for God to dwell. And then it says, and here's the reference to what we just learned, Hine shmanua be'efrata. Now, shmanuha is to hear about it, but it's also to learn. I learned about it be'efrata, and metzanu, I found it b'stei ya'ar. So here's a reference to what we talked about. Be'efrata ze Yoshua, that came from deka'ate me'efraim. So Efrata is a remez, is an allusion to Yoshua, who came from Shevet Ephraim. So I found it in Sefer Yoshua. And Mitzanu b'stei ya'ar ze Binyamin. Binyamin ze'ev yitraf, right? Binyamin is a ze'ev yitraf. So ze'ev is a wolf and lives in the forest. So there's a reference. I found it in the sadeh of the forest, meaning in Binyamin's territory. Okay, so there you have a nice story about how David figured out where exactly to build the Beit HaMikdash. From here, we're going to end our daf with the next Mishnah. So we're on the last Mishnah of Kodesh Kodshim. Then we're going to move into Kodshim Kalim. And I will mention at this point that, first of all, we were just on the Ola, and there's a good shir in Hebrew in Sugya B'Ktana of Merav Tubakana about the Korban Ola. And there's a good shir that went up yesterday in Din Daf about the Korban Hasham of Alana Steinhain. And very interesting about why are these things, why do you bring in Hasham? What's the root of the word Hasham? Where does it come from? Like we usually think of it as guilt. But there's all different interpretations. What's good about these shirim, again, as I always say, they give perspective on the concepts that stand behind all these tedious gemaras that we're learning. What's the difference between a chet and an Hasham? Okay, one of the main differences I'll just mention, but then you can listen to the shiur to hear really the much better and broader analysis. One of the main differences is a chatat is done on an accidental mistake, right? You made a mistake, it's shogeg. Remember, if you do it intentionally, it's karet. But if you do it by accident, but Hasham is mainly, not completely, but mainly not accidental. And it's really only on 5 specific things. So you'll see. Zivchei shalmei tzibor va'ashamot. So our last category, because these are all the same, are shalmei tzibor, which are there's certain shlamim. Shlamim are generally kochim kalim, but there's certain shlamim, like for example, we're going to talk about this tomorrow, the kivsei atzeret, which are there's shlamim that are communal offerings. Usually shlamim is an individual offering. You want to eat meat, but you also want to sacrifice it, so you bring it to the temple and then you get to eat the meat, but part of it is sacrifice. But in the holidays, specifically on Shavuot, there were kivsei atzeret. There were these shlamim offerings that were brought. It goes with the shtei alechem, which is a famous korban, if you know what it is. It was a bread offering. The shalmei tzibor is one category, and Asham is the other category, and they have the same criteria, right? Because we started with the chataot pnimiot. We went to the chataot, the regular chataot, which are different than all the rest because you do them on 4 placings at the top of the altar. Then we got to all the ones that the placings are done at the bottom of the altar. But we started with the ola. That's different and couldn't be listed with all these because that doesn't get eaten. And these both get eaten by, we're going to see the male kohanim. Okay, so here they are. Before we get to the rules about them, here are the ashamot. Eluhen ashamot. Asham gzelot, asham meilot, asham shifra charufa, asham nazir, asham mitzorah, and asham talui. Asham talui is a little different. Usually we talk about there's 5 ashamot, and then there's the asham talui. Maybe we'll start with the asham talui. Also, at some point, I don't remember when, but Alana gave a shir on the asham talui. Very interesting korban. It's you bring it in the meantime about, like, if you don't know if you did a sin. So let's say you had 2 pieces in front of you of fat. One was shuman, one was chelev. You didn't know, first of all, the one was chelev, and then you ate one of them. And now you don't know, did you eat the one that was permitted, the shuman, or did you eat the chelev, which is forbidden? So until you figure it out, you need atonement temporarily. So you bring the asham talui, which is until such time that you figure it out. Okay. When you figure out that you actually ate the chelev, then you have to bring a korban chatat. Your asham talui is not going to help you. It's just temporarily tied you over. Okay, but now let's go through the 5 ashamot. Asham gzelot, that's if someone claims you owe them money, you say, I don't owe you anything, and I'm going to swear about it. And then it turns out you swore falsely. You bring an asham gzelot. Asham meilot, you misuse of consecrated property. This is the one that's specifically shkaga. Okay, it's unintentional. But perhaps one of the things Alana suggests is perhaps because it's kodshim, it's treated more like as if it was intentional. Shifra charufa, there's 2 opinions what this is. So shifra is designated. Okay, some people think that she's a shifra who is designated to an eved ivri. An eved ivri is allowed to be kind of have a relationship with a shifra knaanit while he's enslaved. So if she's designated to a particular eved ivri and then a man has relations with her, he has to bring an asham shifra charufa. It's forbidden because she's designated to someone else. Some people think it's a chetzi, shifcha chetzi bat chorim. She's half free, half slave, like she had 2 masters and one freed her, the other one didn't. And then she's not allowed to marry anyone. And anyway, perhaps that's the shifcha charufa. Asham nazir and asham mitzorah, that's just part of their purification process. The nazir and the mitzorah both have to bring, in addition to some other korbanot, they need to bring an asham. And it's also not exactly, in this case, related directly to a particular sin. So it's a little different than the others. Okay. So, and the Asham Talui. So what are the rules about them? With this we'll finish. Chitatam b'tzafon. So they're still kachim. So they're in the north. Kibul damam b'klei sharet b'tzafon. Again, except the blood in the north. So slaughter in the north, except the blood in the north. Damanta un shtei matanot she'en arba. Same thing. That's what we started today by correcting the mistake from yesterday, right? The Asham and the Shlamim is also 2 that are 4. And ne'achalim lifnim min haklaim, they're eaten within the azara. Lizichrei kuna, for male kohanim, b'chol ma'achal, any way you want to prepare the meat. Leyom v'layla al chatzot. And again, you only get that day and that night until midnight. Again, you really have all night, but the rabbi said until midnight, just like in all the others. And here we're going to end, and tomorrow we're going to figure out how do we know that the asham needs tzafon. Okay, like we've seen before. The shalmei tzibur. How do you know the shalmei tzibur needs tzafon? Okay, asham we saw already, with all those hekesh on the hekesh. Okay, so what we do today, we started with this idea of we brought one difficulty on the yesod, the fact that the yesod, there's no yesod in the Kerem Mizrachi Tromit. What about this ola, which was a very hard question to understand, how they do the ola specifically in that corner, the olat ha'of, without a yesod underneath. And then we answered that really the airspace is Binyamin, the under the ground actually is Yudan. That somehow resolved the problem, which we struggled with a little. We had the machloket Levi and Rav, whether there was really a yesod, just couldn't be used for the blood, or there was no yesod at all on those sides. And we have 4 sources to try to prove one way or the other. And then we had this drasha about David and Shmuel, and how did they figure out where to build the temple. We had 2 kind of ways about how they got to it, 2 different approaches. And then we finished up with the next list of our next Mishnah, which we're going to then get into in the Gemara. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.